Resuming debate, the honourable member for Regina Capel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I have no doubt that many Canadians are watching tonight's debate with a great deal of anxiety for the threat that is facing our country and our economy. Jobs, workers' paychecks, the ability for people to pay their mortgage depend on trade. Canada is a nation that depends on being able to sell what we grow and what we produce here to other countries around the world. We simply don't have the population to consume what we can produce. That's because we're so good at producing things. We're so good at extracting our natural resources at the highest environmental and ethical standards. Our skilled trades and machinists and factory workers are so good at what they do that we can produce far more than we need for ourselves. And so, having an extremely long and undefended border, the longest undefended border in the world, being neighbors with a like-minded democracy that was built on the rule of law, human rights, and most importantly, free market capitalism. The voluntary exchange of goods and services, not just between individuals, but between our countries, have dramatically increased the quality of life, both here and in the United States, to such a degree that people from around the world, of all different faiths and races and ethnicities and cultures, come to Canada. They don't come to Canada for the weather, Madam Speaker. They come to Canada because of the opportunity and the basis of our society that we've built. And the reason why people are so anxious right now is because they've seen the track record of this Prime Minister in dealing with President Trump. The first time this Prime Minister had to go toe-to-toe, head-to-head with President Trump, he was forced to capitulate and accept concession after concession after concession. Forced to accept concessions on agricultural products, forced to accept a deal that didn't protect Canadian steel workers from tariffs from the United States, forced to accept a deal that was silent, that did not offer any protection to forestry workers with a softwood lumber deal as part of it, and forced to accept the humiliating concession that the Prime Minister was unable to get an exemption from the Buy American provisions. So after such a terrible track record the first time Canada faced tariffs from the U.S. administration, there's good reason to be worried right now. And that's just on trade. One of the things that a country can do to protect itself in a potential trade conflict is to make our own economy strong. When investors and business owners are fighting with each other to get into Canadian markets, it's less likely that their home country would want to get in the way of that trade. And what this Prime Minister has done is to put Canada in such an incredibly weak position. Our economy was weak yesterday before these potential tariffs were even announced, and now the Prime Minister is heading into a negotiation period in a position of extreme vulnerability. Let's just take a look at some of the facts. In Canada, GDP per capita is now smaller than it was before this Prime Minister took office. That means the only thing that is even remotely keeping our GDP numbers in a positive way, in a positive trend, is the fact that our population is growing. But each individual Canadian is poorer today, produces less value today because of the Prime Minister's terrible economic vandalism. Just look at some of the things that he's done. He's imposed a devastating carbon tax on the Canadian economy. The United States does not have a carbon tax. And as he quadruples that carbon tax, the difference between our economy and the US economy will be even worse. Why would an investor say, hey, I'd like to build something in Windsor and pay 61 cents a liter when I can build that factory in Detroit and pay 0%? And that's 0 cents a liter in a carbon tax. And that's why it's so puzzling why the member from Windsor, the NDP member from Windsor, who pretends to be worried about this issue, consistently supports the Liberal plan to hike the carbon tax, to quadruple the carbon tax. How many more businesses and jobs and money will flow south of the border as that carbon tax gets higher and higher? Food prices have grown 37% faster in Canada than in the United States. That's because this Prime Minister devalued the Canadian dollar by forcing the Bank of Canada to print hundreds of billions of dollars to cover his deficits and wasteful spending. And what happens when you print money out of thin air? You have more dollars chasing fewer goods. Prices go up. And inflation has hit food prices here in Canada far worse than in the United States. Our national debt has grown by over 100% in a decade. That means the government has to go out into markets to borrow money. And that's an important fact as well, Madam Speaker, because you see, when the government borrows money, it competes with the private sector. When business owners and factory owners and entrepreneurs want to go out and borrow some money to start up a business or scale up a business or expand at a second location or add another product line, they have to go out and compete with the government to borrow that money. And when the government gobbles up a lot of the available funds, it drives up the borrowing costs for everybody else, including individuals, Madam Speaker. It's not just large business owners that have to pay higher borrowing costs when the government goes out and scoops up all the available cash for itself. Your mortgage payment is going to be higher because of all that government borrowing. Because if somebody has $1 to lend it to an individual is a greater risk than to lend it to a government entity, which is viewed as having a much more secure backing to it. So they have to pay a premium to borrow that dollar too. The government's deficits directly have an impact on Canadian borrowers, which include business owners and individuals with mortgages. Where I'm going with all of this is that by weakening the Canadian economy, there are fewer people around the globe fighting to get into Canada. And you only need to develop the thought exercise. Would Canada ever slap these kinds of tariffs unilaterally on the United States? Of course not, because it would risk our markets to sell our products into. The fact that Canada has a weaker economy, our people are poorer, there are less opportunities here, less investments that can turn a profit, that can add to growth and create jobs, means that we have fewer people in the United States fighting to protect access to our markets. So the Prime Minister's devastating and humiliating failure, the first time he had to face President Trump, is a big reason why people are concerned again today. Now, there are a couple of issues aside from economics that have been the subject of debate. And what I'm hearing from many Canadians in the last 24 hours is, why did it take the President of the United States to call out the government's inaction on dealing with the fentanyl and opioid crisis? The Prime Minister should want to get fentanyl off our streets for Canadians, out of concern for the grieving mothers and fathers and husbands and wives who have lost people to this horrible addiction. We have presented comprehensive plans to help stem the tide of illegal drugs coming into Canada with more inspections and better tools for law enforcement. The government not only ignores it, they double down on their failed approach to make bail easier for those criminals, and they even went so far as to use your tax dollar, the tax dollars of Canadians, to fund government-paid-for opioids, which the police say now show up in our communities all the time, all across the country. And again, on the border, we've had, in the last few months, under this Prime Minister, terrorists associated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS coming into Canada. It shouldn't take the President of the United States to call attention to that. A Canadian Prime Minister should want to solve that problem on their own. All that to say, Madam Speaker, it's quite clear. What this episode in the last few days has shown us is that we need a Prime Minister with the brains and the backbone to put Canada first. As the Leader of the Opposition said earlier this evening, Canada first, Canada always, and Canada forever. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And you know, it's interesting. The member was here when his leader actually spoke on this issue, and he talked about military spending and was very critical of the government today for not providing or hitting the 2% mark. Yet the member that just spoke was a part of the Harper government. The leader of the Conservative Party was in cabinet, Madam Speaker, of the Harper government. And the lowest that we've had in the last decade was when, in fact, the leader of the Conservative Party was in cabinet in terms of percentage of the GDP. It actually fell less than 1%. That is something in which I believe amplifies one of the reasons why you just cannot believe what it is that the leader of the Conservative Party is telling Canadians. Listen to what he said in the House, contrast to what he actually did. How can one believe him?
The Honourable Member for Regina Capel.
Let's look at what we did. We got heavy lift aircraft delivered. We started the process on F-35s, something that this Prime Minister then cancelled and had to admit that he made a terrible mistake and restart the process. We just lost hundreds of millions of dollars and many years. Nobody was questioning Canada's commitment to our allies and to NATO under the previous Conservative government. That all started when this Prime Minister started demeaning our military, cancelling procurement projects, and basically telling the world that Canada wasn't going to do its fair share. Conservatives have gotten big projects, big procurement items done. We've had higher levels of recruitment and regular force service levels, something that has fallen under this government as this Prime Minister tells our military that their job is to fight for woke and divisive ideals instead of our proud history and our proud traditions.
Questions et commentaires, Honourable.
Question and comment. Honourable Member for La Salle-Verdun. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I was listening to the member for Regina Capel, and the Conservative solution to the international trade problem seems to be Canada first, so copying America first. And the member was saying we shouldn't take the President of the United States to tell us what we need to do in terms of dealing with drugs. So I understand that we should also be selling our oil to the U.S. So the solution of the Conservative Party to the current problems in terms of international trade, is it to just copy and paste American policy and just be docile and follow American politics?
Regina Capel.
Pas du tout, mais c'est...
Not at all. But it's normal for a government to put our country's own interest first. Because, of course, it's Canadians who pay our salaries, ministers and members alike, so it's clear that the priority for a government of any country should be to put the interest of their citizens first before everything else. And my colleague maybe misunderstood what I was saying on drugs and the border. I wasn't saying that we shouldn't do it because it was being underlined, the challenge was being pointed out by the President of the U.S. I was saying that the Prime Minister should have an interest in solving the issue of drugs and the border.
The Honourable Member for Vancouver East, a brief question.
Kingsway. Thanks, Madam Speaker. Mr. Trump apparently is justifying this ridiculous assertion that Canada deserves 25% tariffs by talking about the border and also talking about Canada not hitting our defense targets. Well, last I checked, Canada determines here in this chamber and in this country, we determine what our military spending is. It's not dictated by a foreign government. And so I have a twofold question. The other thing I was going to mention before I do so is it's up to the Americans to control their border. So if something is coming from Canada into the United States, that's a failure of the Americans to protect their border, not Canada. So to my honourable colleague, the question is this. If we're to increase our military spending to 2 or even 3%, as certain Canadian business groups are calling for, how would he pay for it? How many billions of dollars would that mean to the Canadian budget? How would we pay for it? And does he not agree with me as well that it's up to the American government to protect their own borders? That's not our responsibility.
The honourable member for Regina Capel, a brief answer, please.
Well, first and foremost, let me say that the Conservative Party has been unequivocal. These tariffs are unjustified. My point on the border, on military spending, and on the fentanyl crisis is that regardless of what's going on with the United States, regardless of what President Trump might be threatening Canada with, a Canadian Prime Minister should care about the lives of people lost to addiction, should care about the fact that we've got people coming into our country without proper background checks and security vettings, and that the Canadian people want to see a plan to deal with 400 temporary residents in Canada whose visas are set to expire in the next year. So regardless of what American politicians might want us to do, the Canadian people expect that their government will put their interests first, put their safety and protect their jobs, their livelihood, and their security ahead of all else.